thank you now to Diversity Reading List generally for providing the opportunity to do this series of talks. So I'm Alison Stone, and I've organised all of the other talks in this series, although actually not directly today. But when there was an opening to organise a seminar series within the Diversity Reading List, I thought, okay, I'll take the chance to have some talks about 19th century women philosophers, because there is so many of them.
Take the exit on the left to 834.
There are so many of them, and yet there's so little scholarship about them. And I think that it's one of these problems that becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, because there's not much scholarship on 19th century women philosophers, and so they're not known, and people don't know that there are these figures that they could potentially be knowing about, but aren't. And then it just kind of perpetuates itself. They're the kind of unknowns. So people don't know that there's anyone there to be investigated. And therefore, I hope that the series will make just a very, very, very few of them a little bit better known. And I've focused it on British women. There had to be some principle of narrowing it down, and the 19th century British philosophy is my particular interest at the moment, sort of for the last few years, and it means that they're kind of a coherent set of people who are in a somewhat similar intellectual space. But anyway, I will say a little bit more about that next time, because this first session is a special British Philosophy Postgraduate Association talk, and I think Clotilda is going to introduce our speaker, so I'll hand over to her.
Thank you. Well, I mean, as you said, it's a difficult 19th century women philosophers is difficult to study, and we called for postgraduate contributions on the topic. Turns out that it was actually a bit difficult to gather some people, so we extended the time frame, and we're very glad that we did, because that way we can start a little bit earlier and have a sort of kind of spotlight on Anne Conway with David Harmon, who is a PhD student in the last stages of writing up. Am I right? At the University of St Andrews and Stirling in Scotland. And David's research is mostly metaphysics in the early modern period, with particular focus on Conway and Spinoza, and as well as other expansions on and responses to Cartesianism, and particularly the sort of interaction between metaphysics and physics in the 17th century. And sometimes when I hear that when you don't do history of philosophy, you maybe do a bit of contemporary metaphysics here and there, but yeah. We're glad to hear you talk about Anne Conway today. So please take the floor. I'll spotlight you and share your screen.
That work?
Works for me.
Okay. All right. Well then, yeah. Just first of all, thanks. Thank you very much to the Diversity Reading List for the opportunity to share some work about a figure who is still, in my opinion, at least, pretty underrated. And this is despite some changing winds over the past, past few decades in the scholarship. But one thing to note as I begin, and it's been noted a couple times, I think, maybe, is that this talk is a bit of a strange way to start a series on women in 19th century British philosophy, and it's for a few reasons. One, I'm not a woman, I'm not British, and I'm not talking about the 19th century. What I am talking about is, is it not going to work? There we go. What I am talking about is this 17th century English woman philosopher, Anne Conway, a person whose philosophy has been, in my view at least, extremely influential since its inception, including in the philosophy of the 19th century and the 20th century too. But unfortunately, for various reasons, Conway's philosophy was underappreciated for a long time after her death, at least where explicit recognition is concerned. So many of those connections to later 19th century and 20th century philosophy are sort of obscure, and maybe a little bit underserved by the literature. Now, that being said, I can't promise I'm going to make any of those connections any more explicit over the course of this talk in particular, but I am going to discuss one particular issue in Conway's philosophy that quite deeply involves a lot of the most important pieces of her philosophy. And so the topic that I want to cover is the somewhat surprising connections that arise between Conway's conception of geometric figure and her conception of life. But before really diving into that, I think it's sort of important to note a few things about Conway's work and to make a few general points, I guess, about her philosophy first. So the only writings that we have from Conway today are her relatively extensive correspondence and her pretty short book, The Principles of the Most Ancient and Modern Philosophy. Now, The Principles is a really strange book in many ways, but at its core, it espouses a remarkably complex philosophical system that's centered on a really deep interaction between metaphysics and value theory, and that ultimately serves as a theodicy and a really bold universal soteriology, all of which relies on a pretty intricate ontology. And amongst these, well, what I would call achievements, the Principles also involves a number of paradoxes or conflicts of doctrine, or maybe, ostensible conflicts, which might sort of threaten to undermine it. And the reasons for this are many, right? The book was written privately. It was never really intended for publication, at least probably not. It was written in extremely faint script, so that means only the legible portions of it survive, which of course implies that there are missing portions of the text. And further, the text was likely, actually not even likely, it was certainly very heavily edited after Conway's death by its publishers. And that might be one of the sources of these internal puzzles. And last, the original English text remains lost to us. Conway wrote the text in English, but it was translated into Latin for publication. And the Latin text is the oldest surviving version that we have today. So for all these reasons, I think that rather than reading Conway as committed to these contradictions that are sort of apparent in the text, I think a reader ought to be motivated by an appreciation for the unique value of Conway's thought, and of course also by a pretty liberally applied principle of charity. I think a reader should be motivated to assume that all of these apparent flaws in the text are just that, apparent. But of course, apparent problems still require solutions in a lot of cases. So if there is some problem that's apparent in Conway's system, then developing an interpretation of the system that sort of circumvents that problem is important. It's an important task, I think. And so that's kind of what I want to do in this talk with regard to some conflicting things that Conway says about shape and geometric figure. And I'm hoping that along the way, this also reveals some pretty impressive stuff about Conway's philosophy. So probably the best way to start any talk about Conway is to note that she's a theist. She believes in God. In fact, she just takes it as obvious that God exists. The very first thing that she does in the Principles is not defend God's existence, but instead she just presents this list of God's features. She says, quote, God is spirit, light, and life, infinitely wise, good, just, strong, all-knowing, all-present, all-powerful, the creator and maker of all things visible and invisible, unquote. So this is, for the most part, a pretty standard account of God, I think, for a Christian philosopher at least. It gets us all of those omni adjectives that philosophers like to attribute to God, and it also gets a bit of flair from the Nicene Creed. So there's nothing quite outrageous here. But immediately after noting that these positive features that God has, Conway goes on to describe some of the things that we can't attribute to God. She says, quote, in God there is no time, change, arrangement, or division of parts, for he is wholly and universally one in himself and within himself, without any variation or admixture. In himself he has no darkness or corporeality at all, nor any form, image, or figure whatsoever. So, unquote. So given that I already said that I want to talk about figure, this passage is quite important to me, or quite important to what I want to say, I guess, in that it reveals that Conway thinks of God as having no figure whatsoever. And additionally, it's also important because I think it establishes a close relationship between form, image, and figure, which will become important a bit later. But on that point, it's also worth looking at this passage too, which illustrates one of the difficulties of interpreting the principles. Conway says, in God there is an idea which is his image, or the word existing within himself, which in substance or essence is one and the same with him, through which he knows himself as well as other things, as well as all other things, and indeed all creatures were made or created according to this very idea or word, unquote. So this passage is invoking some interesting biblical and Trinitarian vocabulary that is meant to describe something about the relationship between God and creatures. But it also seems to feature an explicit contradiction with the previous passage. These two passages are literally only sentences apart in the text, and yet they feature Conway claiming that God has no image, and of course that God has an image. And I'm not going to belabor this point, at least not any further than I am now. But I thought it would be useful to point out, at least, since it's a good example of one of those conflicts that I was talking about just a minute ago. Even if these conflicts are only apparent instead of real, they can often be super apparent, and that makes them sort of difficult to deal with. But we also learn from this passage, I think, and from the first one on the screen, that Conway thinks of God as a creator, which of course isn't surprising. But the philosophical version of the creation story that Conway wants to tell is actually a bit surprising, I think. And this is because of the way that she conceives of the difference between God and creatures, as well as how she thinks about causation. But let's talk about creation first. Conway thinks of creation as different from God on grounds of mutability. That is, creatures are mutable and God is immutable. Conway says of God that, quote, if there were any mutability in God, it is necessary that it would tend toward the utmost measure and degree of goodness. In this case, however, he would not be the highest good, which is a contradiction. Now, there is no greater being than God, and he cannot improve or be made better in any way, much less decrease, which would imply his imperfection. Therefore, it is clear that God, or the highest being, is wholly unchangeable, unquote. But then Conway goes on to say this of creatures, quote, moreover, since the nature of creatures is really distinct from the nature of God, inasmuch as he has certain attributes which cannot be communicated to his creatures, among which attributes is unchangeableness, it necessarily follows that creatures are changeable, unquote. Now, importantly, creaturely mutability for Conway doesn't seem to manifest only in the fact that creatures frequently change their features, right? It's not just that people get taller and the leaves change color and buildings crumble and the weather gets hotter. It's also that creatures change with regard to their moral status. So while God is immutably good, creatures can change both for good and bad. In other words, I can become a better person and I can become a worse person. And this is really important for Conway. It's not just that creatures can change that makes them distinct from God. It's that creatures can get better and worse, morally speaking. Now, Conway herself sees something of an issue here, a problem maybe. How can it be the case that God is the cause of creatures if God is so fundamentally unlike creatures? How could it be that an immutable thing causes a mutable thing? Where does the mutability come from if it's not in God? And this question is motivated by a principle that you may or may not find intuitive, and it's the principle that causes need to be similar to their effects in some important way. Now, Conway herself is definitely committed to this principle, especially with regard to thinking about creation as a kind of causation. And this is because of a really deep Neoplatonic influence. Conway thinks of God's creation in terms of emanation. She says, quote, God is infinitely good, loving, and bountiful. Indeed, he is goodness and charity itself, the infinite fountain and ocean of goodness, charity, and bounty. In what way is it possible for that fountain not to flow perpetually and to send forth living waters? For will not that ocean overflow in its perpetual emanation and continual flux for the production of creatures, unquote. So not only does Conway explicitly pick out emanation here, but she also describes the creation relation that holds between God and creatures using this vocabulary that's really reminiscent of, the way that the Neoplatonics describe emanation. So emanation is a weird relation, surely. But I think we can understand the relation that holds between God and creation in Conway according to the following 4 requirements, which I've taken them from, or roughly I've taken them from Sebastian Bender's great paper about Conway's metaphysics of change. Now, I'm of the view that we should take each of these requirements pretty loosely, but I do think that these sort of roughly characterize the way that Conway is thinking about emanative causation. So first, if X emanates Y, then X is more ontologically fundamental than Y. And this sort of obviously works for God and creation, right? God is just definitely ontologically prior to creation. And second, if X emanates Y, then X is a continuous cause of Y. And this one's a bit more complicated in Conway's philosophy for some interesting reasons that I don't, have time to get into right now. But it is, I think, still true of God and creation. At any given moment, God is properly conceived as the cause of creation's being. So third, if X emanates Y, then X doesn't lose any of its being to Y, but Y has less being than X. And again, this is going to be true of God and creatures. God is immutable, so it isn't possible that God's act of creation leads to God losing any being. But it is the case that creatures are, so to speak, less real than God, in that they don't share in all of God's perfection. And then lastly, if X emanates Y, then the being that Y gets from X must be relevantly similar to the being of X. So Bender calls this the prefigurement clause, and it basically just means that if Y has feature F and X emanates, if Y has feature F and emanates from X, then X must also have F in some respect. So F, the feature, has to be prefigured in X somehow. And this is where the problem arises. Creatures are mutable and are emanated from God, but it isn't clear how mutability could possibly be prefigured in God, since God is immutable. This is kind of a classic problem. Conway solves this by introducing a substance between God and creatures on this emanative chain. The substance is what she calls Christ. So God emanates Christ, and Christ emanates creatures. So the emanation relation that holds between God and creatures is sort of indirect. It sort of passes through Christ. But how does this solve the problem? So to answer that, we need to look at the way that Conway characterizes Christ. She's not talking about like the human Jesus. I mean, she kind of is, but not really. There's an interesting and sort of obscure relationship between Christ, the mediating substance, and Jesus Christ, the individual figure for Conway. But I'm not going to get into it now. What's relevant, I think, is that Conway thinks of Christ, the mediating substance, as mutable, like creatures, but as perpetually good, like God. Conway says, quote, creatures could not be equal to Christ, nor of the same nature, because his nature could never degenerate like theirs and change from good into bad, unquote. And later, she goes on to say that, quote, there are two kinds of change. One has the intrinsic power of changing itself either for good or bad, and this is common to all creatures, but not to the firstborn of all creatures. The other kind of change is the power of moving only from one good to another, unquote. So the idea is that Christ can change. Christ is mutable, but only for the better. So the difference between God and creatures is that God can't change, right? While creatures can change and fluctuate in their moral status. Christ, on the other hand, can only morally improve. In other words, with regard to moral kind, Christ is immutable. But with regard to moral degree, Christ is mutable. And you can see how this fits the prefigurement requirement, I think, better than otherwise, maybe. If the requirement is that emanative causes be relevantly similar to their effects, then Christ sort of fits the bill with regard to God. Christ's moral status is prefigured in God. That is, goodness is prefigured in God. Now, the reason that this goodness is mutable, that is, less perfect, is because of that third requirement. That the emanated thing has less being than the emanating thing. And this allows us to understand Christ as emanating creatures. The mutability of creatures is already prefigured in Christ, but because of that third requirement, creatures have to be less perfect than Christ. So their mutability can only manifest, or doesn't only manifest positively. Creatures can both change for better and for worse. So now's a good time to quote from a passage that's sort of become something of a slogan for this like trialistic ontology. Conway says, therefore, there are three kinds of being. The first is altogether immutable. The second can only change toward the good, so that which is good by its very nature can become better. The third kind is that which, although it was good by its very nature, is nevertheless able to change from good to good, as well as from good to evil. The first and last of these three kinds are opposites. The second is the natural medium between them, through which the extremes are united. So this is how Conway explains the fact that a good, immutable God can be the cause of morally fluctuating creatures. Christ mediates between God and creatures, since Christ shares in the relevant features of God and also shares in the relevant features of creatures. Okay, so let's finally dig into shape and figure. I think a similar problem can be generated with figure. And so to establish that, the first point to make is that I think it's clear that Conway uses figure and shape, those two words, roughly interchangeably. When she talks about something's figure, she's talking about its shape. And I think this passage will illustrate that pretty well. She says, quote, we have such an example in a triangular prism, which is the first figure of all solid rectilinear bodies into which a body can be changed. From this, it may change into a cube, which is a more perfect figure and includes the prism. From the cube, it can change into another more perfect figure, which comes nearer to a sphere, and from this into another, which is even closer to perfection. So I think this passage makes it pretty clear that Conway's thinking of shape and figure as the same sorts of thing, right? Cubes and triangles and spheres. This is what she's invoking when she uses the word figure, right? The different shapes that something can have. So knowing this, it's pretty clear that Conway thinks that creatures themselves, are the things that have figures. That is, creatures come in shapes. And there's plenty of evidence for this in the Principles, but here's a sort of smattering of passages that we could maybe take as confirming it. Every creature receives its external shape. As for the remaining attributes of matter, namely hardness, shape, and motion. Mobility and the capacity for having a shape follow from extension, and one and the same body can be changed or can change into shapes of every sort. So we can glean from all of this that for Conway, extended creatures have shapes, they have figures. And obviously this isn't surprising, right? In fact, it's maybe just common sense. But what is sort of shocking is that Conway thinks that every creature has a shape, and this includes minds and souls and spirits. And this is because of the fact that Conway thinks that spirit itself is extended. In fact, her thesis is much bolder than that. Unlike Descartes, who thought of bodies and spirits, or bodies and minds, choose your preferred vocabulary, Descartes thought that they were fundamentally distinct substances, only one of which was extended. Conway, though, thinks that body and spirit are the same substance. For Conway, body just is a particular mode that a fundamentally spiritual substance can take on. So Conway characterizes body as just a crasser or a grosser spirit. She says that, quote, the soul is of one nature and substance with the body, although it surpasses the body by many degrees of life and spirituality, just as it does in swiftness and penetrability and various other perfections. So spirits just have different degrees of corporeality. Some are denser and more bodily, and others are more ethereal and subtle. But creatures can move up and down on this gradient. And what this tells us is that Conway doesn't think that just bodies have shapes, but that spirits have shapes too. You know, all creatures of whatever kind have shapes. But remember that passage from before. In God, there is no time, change, arrangement, or division of parts, for he is wholly and universally one in himself and within himself, without any variation or admixture. In himself, he has no darkness or corporeality at all, nor any form, image, or figure whatsoever. So here we are with a problem that's similar to the mutability issue, right? God has no figure. God has no shape. But creatures do have figure or shape. So creatures have shape even though shape isn't prefigured in their cause. So how do we get figure onto the ontological scene, so to speak? Now, in order to answer that, I think we need to do a little bit of clarification about why Conway thinks that any given creature, like you or me or, you know, my computer, the building I'm in, or the sun, right? Why any given creature is shaped the way that it is. And as is pretty common for Conway, the story that she wants to tell about this is pretty wild. So since Conway thinks that all bodies are just spirits that have taken on a particular mode of being, that is, you know, corporeality, crassness, grossness, she thinks that absolutely every created being is at bottom a spirit. And this is what makes Conway a vitalist. Absolutely everything is alive. Every person, animal, plant, rock, atom, star, all of it, everything is essentially animated, active, perceptual. Life is just baked in to the very bottom of her created ontology, since everything is spiritual. But if it's right that everything from the bottom to the top is fundamentally a spirit, then it seems that any given creature, while being a spirit itself, is composed of spirit as well. So for instance, clearly I, David, have a spirit. But my body is composed of other smaller bodies, which themselves have to be spirits, according to Conway's ontology. So why is it that my spirit, the David spirit, is in control, so to speak, and not any of those other spirits that constitute me? And I think we find the answer in this quotation. Conway says, quote, every creature must be numerous without number or infinite. But if someone says it is necessary that a central or ruling spirit may be a single atom, for why else is it called a central or principal spirit having dominion over all the rest? I answered no. For this central ruling or principal spirit is multiple for the reasons stated above. Indeed, the unity of spirits composing this central predominant spirit is firmer and more tenacious than that of other spirits, which are like angels or servants of the principal spirit and leader. This unity is so great that nothing can dissolve it. Thus it happens that the soul of every human being will remain a whole soul for eternity and endure without end, so that it may receive proper rewards for its labor, unquote. So I take this passage to be explaining that in any given creature, which is of course composed of an infinity of different spiritual parts, there is some precise spirit which is dominant on account of the fact that its parts are arranged in like a particularly robust unity. So any given creature has some dominant or principal spirit, which is the one that's like in control, right? And this is important for present purposes because Conway ultimately thinks that this dominant spirit is going to be the partial source of the shape of the creature with which it's associated. So that's what Conway seems to be explaining in this passage. She says, quote, "In every visible creature there is body and spirit, or a more active principle and a more passive principle. Moreover, spirit is light, or the eye looking at its own proper image, and the body is the darkness which receives this image. Just as every spirit needs a body to receive and reflect its image, it also needs a body to retain the image. And whatever spirit is strongest and has the strongest image or idea, that spirit forms a body as similar as possible to its image, and thus every creature receives its external shape." Unquote. Seems like what's going on here is that the dominant spirit in any given creature imposes a shape on the creature's bodily parts. And that's going to be in accordance with its image, this image that's internal to the dominant spirit itself. So by imposing a shape on the bodily parts, the dominant spirit gives the creature its shape. So the reason I have the shape that I do is because my spirit has some internal image that's associated with this shape, and my spirit arranges my bodily parts in such a way that my body takes on that shape. But now an obvious question should arise. What is this image thing that my spirit has? And why does my spirit have an image that's associated with this particular shape and not some other shape? So let's recall that what makes something a creature is essentially that it has the capacity to change for better and worse, morally speaking. So in other words, for Conway, change just is a moral phenomenon. And this is one of the ways that, as I was saying before, Conway's system is built on a deep interaction between metaphysics and value theory. Any given change that happens to a creature just has moral significance. But it's really important for Conway that there are no limits to how much a creature could possibly improve. If there was some kind of limit, then this would end up being a pretty significant restriction on God's power, because this would mean that there was a limitation on the things that God could create. But there's also, for Conway, and this is a weird doctrine, but there's only a finite amount of difference between any two, given types of creatures. To use Conway's preferred example, the differences between a horse and a human are many, right? But they are finite. A horse has some list of features that is finite, and a human has some list of features that are finite. And because these are, horses and humans are both at the bottom spiritual substances, they have the same types of features. So any two creatures are only finitely different from one another. But we also know that every creature has an infinite capacity for change, because of course it has an infinite capacity for moral improvement. So this means that in principle, any creature could possibly change into any other kind of creature. And we can see this come up in Conway's description of what happens when someone dies. She says, quote, "For example, is it not just that if a man lives a pure and holy life on this earth like the heavenly angels, that he is elevated to the rank of angels after he dies and becomes like them, since the angels also rejoice over him? But if someone lives a brutish or animal life, so that his spirit is more like the spirit of beasts than any other creature, does the same justice not act most justly, so that just as he became a brute in spirit and allowed his brutal part and spirit to have dominion over his more excellent part, he also, at least as regards his external shape, changes his corporeal shape into that species of beast to which he is most similar in terms of the qualities and conditions of his mind," unquote. So the point seems to be that the shape of any given creature is tied up with that creature's moral status. And this is further confirmed when Conway says that, or when Conway asks what happens when a horse dies. But in particular, a horse who has, morally speaking, lived the ideal horse life. So she says, if it is said that it returns to life and obtains the body of another horse, but stronger and more beautiful and with a better spirit than before, excellent. If it dies a second, third, or fourth time, does it always remain a horse, even though it becomes continuously better and more excellent? Now I ask whether the species of horse possesses such infinite perfection that a horse can always become better and better to infinity, yet always remain a horse. Now, this is a rhetorical question for Conway, and the answer to it is, she thinks, obviously no. Eventually, the spirit will have a moral status that exceeds the figure of a horse. So it will eventually take on some new shape. Now, of course, in the background of all of this is clearly some conception of reincarnation. Conway thinks that creatures reincarnate, and the subsequent lives that they live somehow hinge on the moral status that they've developed up until that point. She has some really interesting arguments, I think, for this surprising conclusion, and I wish I had time to give it a more developed treatment, but unfortunately, I'm just going to have to leave it in the background moving forward. But okay, from all of this, I think we can gather that the image that belongs to a dominant or principal spirit is an expression of its moral status. So the reason that my dominant spirit imposes this particular shape on my bodily parts is because my dominant spirit has an image that corresponds to the moral status in line with a human being. If this moral status had been less developed, then I might have instead had the external shape of a horse, or worse, a bug or a rock, whatever. If my moral status was a lot better, then I might have instead been shaped like an angel. So to put this a little bit more mechanically, what determines the shape of any given creature is its dominant spirit, which is the most robust unity of spiritual parts in that creature. And that dominant spirit has an image that's internal to it, which determines the figure of the bodily parts of the creature. And it gets this image from its moral status, which fluctuates according to whether or not it has lived well. So this should make it quite clear, I think, that a creature's life, that is its vital characteristics, are essential to its having the feature that it has. And I think Conway explicitly agrees with this. For instance, this really long, but frankly, to me, exciting quotation says that, quote, shape and life are distinct but not incompatible attributes of one and the same substance. Shape serves the operations of life. As we see in the bodies of humans and brutes, the shape of the eye serves sight, the shape of the ear serves hearing, the shape of the mouth, teeth, lips, and tongue serves speech, the shape of the hands and fingers work, and the shape of the feet walking. And thus the shapes of all the other limbs have their use and contribute greatly to the vital operations which the spirits perform in those limbs. Indeed, the shape of the entire body is more suitable than any other shape that could exist or that could be made for the proper operation of human life. Consequently, shape and life coexist exceedingly well in one substance or body, where shape is the instrument of life, without which no vital operation could be performed. So this passage tells us that every creature has shape and life, but it also establishes this sort of fascinating hierarchy. So it's clear that Conway thinks of shape as somehow subservient to life. The human body, for instance, right, is shaped the way that it is in order for it to be able to hear and see and speak and work and walk. So this means that the dominant spirit in that creature, a human, has a moral status that's described by a certain image, which involves each of those vital functions. So perceiving in those ways and originating actions in those ways are crucial to that creature's image. So when the spirit imposes its image on its bodily parts, its body takes the shape that's conducive to fulfilling those functions. And that is, of course, the shape of the human body. And this means that a creature's shape is explainable in terms of what kind of life it is morally equipped to live. The vital features of the creature, the features that characterize its life, explain its shape. The vital explains the mechanical for Conway. And this is, to my eye, an astonishing subversion of what would have been the predominant view, or the predominant and growing view in the intellectual scene of Conway's day. Descartes' philosophy would have been sort of taking over the world at this time, and you know, Descartes' philosophy sort of dictates the opposite. Now we know, you know, Descartes famously devised this really impressive system in mechanics, according to which all the features of the physical world could be explained according to motion and shape and arrangement of material bodies. He says, quote, "If you find it strange that in explaining these elements I do not use the qualities called heat, cold, moisture, and dryness, as the philosophers do, I shall say to you that these qualities themselves seem to me to need explanation. Indeed, unless I'm mistaken, not only these four qualities, but all others as well, can be explained without the need to suppose anything in their matter other than the motion, size, shape, and arrangement of its parts," unquote. Everything about the material world, all its features, its qualities, and everything about its status is just the kind of thing that you can describe in terms of shape and motion and size, etc. So what explains that a human can walk? What explains that a human can see and hear? And what explains that a human can speak? For Descartes, the answer is mechanics. The size, shape, and motion of the material parts of the human explains all of those vital functions. So for Descartes, life sort of like grafts on to onto the mechanics. And I think we see similar views in lots of Conway's contemporaries. You can find this sort of thing in Hobbes and Spinoza, for instance. You know, maybe with a few caveats that I can't get into at the moment. But the point is that I think it would be fair to conceive of the default view in this context to be the view that shape is one of the more basic features of material ontology that explains life. And Conway's quite clear that she thinks Descartes' mechanical philosophy, while being, you know, very impressive, is just wrong on this account. She says, quote, "Although it cannot be denied that Descartes taught many remarkable and ingenious things concerning the mechanical aspects of natural processes, and about how all motions proceed according to regular mechanical laws, truly in nature there are many operations that are far more than merely mechanical. Nature is not simply an organic body like a clock, which has no vital principle of motion in it, but it is a living body which has life and perception," unquote. So since she sees Descartes as having failed on this account, Conway sort of just flips the Cartesian paradigm. Life explains shape. And she says that shape is the instrument of life. So the reason that creatures take the shape that they do is because of the vital facts that characterize their dominant spirit in accordance with, you know, their moral status. I find this to be just a shocking result. But I don't think that this shocking result concludes Conway's account of figure. Conway's placed life at the very bottom of her ontology, prior to mechanics and prior even to geometry, as we've seen. But there's one further feature of creatures that I think partially determines their shape. That is, Conway thinks that every creature, whether it's more bodily or more spiritual, is impenetrable. And so this is a common way of thinking about bodies in Conway's time. You know, they can't pass through each other. They can't simultaneously occupy the same space as one another, at least not without increasing in volume. They can't like phase through one another. But in Conway's time, of course, it was common also to think of spirits as unlike bodies in this sense. That is, spirits can pass through bodies. They can occupy the same space as bodies, etc. So again, Conway breaks with the common tradition and just denies this. She thinks that since spirits and bodies are, you know, are on the same gradient, spirits are also impenetrable. Spirits and bodies can't pass through one another. They can't occupy the same space. They can't phase into one another. So this means that, you know, when Conway says that I, David, have a spirit and a body, she literally means, I think, that, you know, my spiritual parts exist in like the physical space between my atoms. And by having a spirit, I actually weigh a little bit more than I would if I didn't have a spirit. And it's because of this impenetrability that spirits can interact with bodies. Conway says, clearly this is the cause of all those motions which we see in the world when one thing moves another, namely that the two are impenetrable. Were it not for this impenetrability, one creature could scarcely move another, because they would not oppose or resist each other in any way. She goes on to use a great example of a ship and its sails. The reason that the wind moves the ship is because the sails offer like resistance against the wind, in order, resistance that the wind can push against. But instead, if you unfurled a net instead of a sail, then the ship would hardly move, because the wind would just pass right through it. And she thinks the same about the impenetrability of spirits. If spirits were penetrable and could just pass through bodies, then they would never move bodies. They would never be able to causally interact with bodies. So creatures, whether they are body or spirit, interact with one another in virtue of the fact that they're both impenetrable. But of course, this means that a creature's mechanical status, that is its size and its shape and its motion, is partially determined by the bodies that are around it. When a creature causally interacts with another creature, since they can't co-locate, one of them has to change its shape or motion or its size in order to sort of accommodate the other one. But Conway also accepts a plenum physics. Space is totally full of creatures. There are no gaps in space. There's no place where there are no creatures. But I think all of this together seems to imply that for Conway, creation is like a fully causally integrated system. Any interaction between creatures results in some kind of change of shape, motion, or size. But since there are no gaps between any creatures, every such change in shape, motion, or size necessarily is going to have knock-on effects. So it's possible for some creaturely collision on one side of the universe to eventually have some effect on the other side. And I think this explains why Conway says things like this. Quote, there is a certain mutuality between creatures in giving and receiving, through which one supports another, so that one cannot live without the other. What creature in the entire universe can be found which does not need its fellow creatures? Certainly none. Consequently, every creature which has any life, sense, or motion must be multiple or numerous. Indeed, from the perspective of every created intellect, it must be numerous without number or infinite, unquote. And further, it's also pretty common for Conway to refer to all of creation as one causally integrated body. She says, quote, there exists a general unity of all creatures with one another, such that no one can be separated from his fellow creatures, unquote. And further, quote, in whatever way spirits or bodies may be divided or separated from each other throughout the universe, they always remain united in this separation, since the whole creation is always just one substance or entity, and there is no vacuum in it, unquote. Now, what I think this tells us is that if you pick any given creature and ask what the reason is that it has the shape that it has, then the full story is going to have to be that it's determined partially by the image that's internal to its dominant spirit, and partially by its interactions with the entirety of the rest of creation. Its dominant spirit and its and the mechanical status of the rest of the universe jointly determine the geometric figure of any creature. Okay, so finally, after that long discursus about what exactly figure is for Conway, I think we're equipped to solve the problem that I was describing before, that God, without any figure, produces creatures which have figure, even though effects must have their features prefigured in their cause. So remember that Conway solved this problem where mutability is concerned by positing that Christ, the middle substance, has mutability in a way that makes it so that the relevant feature is prefigured in God, while another relevant feature can be communicated to creatures. Now, it would be nice if something so clean were possible with figure, if we could just say that Christ has figure in some way, and that it's prefigurement in God, or that makes it prefigured in God, and that makes communication to creatures unproblematic. That would be great. But the solution that I want to propose kind of makes the same move, but not with Christ. Instead, I want to think of the whole of creation as somehow featuring figure in an unproblematic way, right? I want to say that while God has no figure, and perhaps Christ has no figure either, the entirety of creation itself, since it's infinite, has no external figure. That is, it has no outside edges that sort of enclose it within a geometrical figure. But it does, of course, have an internal shape. Its parts, that is, all the creatures that exist, are arranged amongst each other in some particular way. It does have edges, so to speak, but all of those edges are going to be internal to it. So I think this is similar to the way that Christ is mutable with regard to moral degree, but immutable with regard to moral kind. And if that's right, then the origin, or the story of the origin of geometric figure in Conway's system is that God has no figure, but emanates Christ. Whether or not Christ has any kind of figure is something I'm remaining agnostic about for the time being. But let's just assume, for the sake of simplicity, Christ has no figure. Then Christ emanates all of creation, which has no figure in the sense of external determination, but it does have figure in the sense that it has internal arrangement or shape. And in virtue of this internal arrangement, the parts of all of creation themselves have external figure, determinations on their shape, right, that give them physical edges. And this makes some sense, I think, given that any creature's shape is the result of its relations with every other creature in existence. Since a creature's shape is determined by its own dominant spirit and the mechanical status of all other creatures, the creature's shape is determined both by itself and by everything other than itself. So if we treat, of course, these two variables as a conjunction, then it's right to say that any given creature's shape is given to it by the whole of creation. So this means that the whole of creation, on my view, mediates between gods having no figure and creatures having figure, by the whole by itself having an internal determination, but no external determination. Now, admittedly, there are some worries that one could have about this. There are some times in the principles where Conway explicitly hedges against the notion that there could be mediators other than Christ. And since my view sort of treats the whole of creation as a mediator, that could cause me a bit of trouble. But I don't think this is devastating. I think I could offer some explanation that circumvents that issue. But I think I've been saved by the bell with regard to offering that explanation. So since I've sort of run up the time, I'll leave it there for now. So thank you, everybody.